John Barrasso is chairman of the Senate Republican Policy Committee. Good to have you with us this morning, Senator.
Thanks, Shannon. Great to be with you.
Okay, so you have heard the critiques from your Democratic colleagues, including there in the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. He says it's a nightmare unless you happen to be a healthy millionaire. So where does the conversation now go in the Senate? Will you take any of what's happened in the House bill? Are you starting completely from scratch?
Well, we're writing our own bill, but the nightmare itself is Obamacare. I mean, why are we here trying to write a new health care law? This isn't a replacement. It's a rescue for what's happening around the country. The CBO has a credibility gap in that they've been wrong so often about Obamacare. But let's talk about the facts today. What we know is the last 4 years, insurance premiums under Obamacare have doubled in the 30-some states where they just have the Obamacare exchange. And just yesterday, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Kansas City has pulled out of Missouri and Kansas. So there are people there who have no options to buy health insurance at all. In Wyoming, we're down to one choice, but now there are places around the country who nobody is selling because it is such a bad deal that so few people are buying.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of question about the CBO's estimates. I mean, they're working with numbers they're provided. These aren't perfect. We want to give you some examples, though, so people know what we're talking about when we reference how off they were about some of the Obamacare predictions. They estimated 20 million people would enroll in Obamacare exchanges. In reality, it's closer to 10 million. They predicted 4 million people would enroll in an Obamacare small business program. The actual number, less than 250,000, 233,000. And they drastically underestimated Medicaid expansion predictions. Medicaid expansion costs ended up being 62% higher than they expected for $26 billion. Now, I know that these programs and the expansion of Medicaid and Medicare, that's been a hot topic. We know it is one of the sticking points in the Senate. Knowing how far off the CBO was in the wrong direction, how do you and your colleagues iron that out now on the Senate side with this new reform?
Well, we're continuing to look for ways to lower premiums. I mean, that's what I hear about every weekend. I was at a health fair in Lovell, Wyoming this weekend. People are saying the premiums, the costs are too high. We got to lower the premiums. We also need to protect people with pre-existing conditions, and we're working on that. But this is a rescue operation for the people who have been caught in the collapsing Obamacare exchanges. We need to provide something so that they can actually get insurance. And that's what we've been working on. We'll meet for a couple of hours today. We met yesterday, the day before. All the Republican senators are involved with bringing forth their best ideas to get this done, and we go home every weekend and then come back with the best ideas from around the country.
One of the most critical sticking points on the House side was this idea of state waivers, which ultimately was part of what they passed, that MacArthur amendment, that would allow states to opt out if they can prove they have other safety nets from a number of things that people say will drive up costs for those with pre-existing conditions, for old people, for less healthy people. The CBO's estimate now says that a sixth of the U.S. population, they think, will be in states where they get those waivers, and those people are going to be impacted by higher prices.
Well, I read the entire report. I mean, it's interesting. They make assumptions. They say half of the states won't do anything. They say a third of the states will do marginal changes, and then a sixth of the states, they say, will go further. But I was in the state Senate in Wyoming, and as a doctor and as a state senator, I always felt we could do a much better job in Wyoming if we did it the Wyoming way rather than the Washington one-size-fits-all way. So I encourage states to take waivers, make decisions on their own, do what works best in that state, not what Washington says you have to do. And I think that was one of the major problems with Obamacare, Shannon, from the beginning.
All right, let me get you to respond to this CBO example as well. They give us a 64-year-old who's earning $26,500 a year. They say their premium under what the House passed would spike 800%. From about $1,700 to $13,600. Is that a framework the Senate can work with?
Well, no, we are actually working on dealing with that. Senator Thune from South Dakota has been very active in an amendment to help try to smooth that out in a better way. We want people to have affordable care so they can get the care they need from a doctor they choose at lower costs. What we've been seeing with Obamacare is people can't keep their doctor, can't keep their insurance plan. And when you have people that have been going to a doctor and they find out that even under Obamacare with the narrower networks, they can't keep their doctor. And if they're going to several doctors and can't keep any of them, that's another violation of the promises that President Obama has made. We need something that was better, Shannon, than it even was before Obamacare was passed. I said that as a doctor years ago. We need a better system for America. It's interesting that California is now proposing universal coverage and care for everyone, and they costed it out, and they said, well, it's $400 billion, which is more than twice the cost of the entire budget of the state, which means you'd have to get rid of police, teachers, firefighters, and raise taxes to get what the folks who are talking about universal coverage want.
Yeah, and that math doesn't seem to work. Okay, Senator Barrasso, good to see you, sir. Thank you for your
Thanks
time.
For having me.
This is going to be with us for some time. We'll have more on the CBO News and the healthcare fight coming up next hour. Ohio.
Residents of parts of Ohio assessing the damage this morning after a violent overnight of storms.
Anybody can see this. Take cover.
Check out that funnel cloud spotted near Jeffersonville. It was just one of several potential tornadoes sighted all across the state so far. No reports of any injuries.
We are minutes away from one of the more important stops in President Trump's trip overseas. NATO headquarters, Brussels, Belgium, the blue carpet, and the leaders come in one by one, the very heart of the Western Alliance. The commander-in-chief will meet his fellow NATO leaders, where he's expected to press them on paying their fair share to maintain the alliance and also saying that America has their backs. And that's not all. Andrew Peake, former U.S. Army intelligence officer, former advisor of the U.S. and NATO commanders in Afghanistan. How are you, sir, and welcome here
Thanks,
to America's
Bill.
Newsroom.
Great to be here.
Just want to bring you back to Newt Gingrich's piece today in the Washington Post. And one of the things he talks about was the phrase that President Trump used on principled realism. And what Gingrich says is that's based on a clear-eyed view of America's interests and security and limits. I think 1 and 2 have been covered for years. But the limits of American influence and power and assistance, just talk about that for a moment. How does this president define that, Andrew?
Well, I think the emergence of the acknowledgement of limits in the American political spectrum is something that's really only emerged over the last 2 years. You know, I think it's very telling that the two candidates in the Republican primary who were most successful, Cruz and Trump, were the ones who most clearly defined a more restrained posture for America in the world. And largely that's a reaction to not just the Obama administration and its adventures in Libya, but also the Bush administration and, in fact, the Iraq war. And I think over the long run, Trump has been successful because, unlike even Cruz, he could say, hey, look, Iraq, even Afghanistan, Libya, these were all mistakes. America should have a much more restrained respect for what it can do overseas.
Okay, now Dan Henninger, Wall Street Journal. Let's turn our focus to Europe because he writes the following. Mr. Trump meets Thursday in Brussels with NATO allies who since 2015 have experienced Islamic State's mass murders in Paris, Nice, Berlin, Copenhagen, Brussels, Stockholm, London, and now Manchester. His basic message, it's time to get serious, is important and deserves support both over there and in the White House. So how is that basic message received?
Oh, I think it's received loud and clear. You know, if anything, this summit is about getting specific military commitments out of our European states and allies for operations against ISIS. You know, I think there is a very clear realization in the White House that kind of gauzy acknowledgments of common interest in fighting terrorism are all well and good, but what we need is actual commitments. We need troops in the Middle East, we need bombing missions, we need intelligence support, and those things I'm not sure are coming out of NATO just yet.
Interesting, because the Secretary General pretty much admitted that NATO needs to take a bigger role. Listen, this is on their doorsteps.
No, absolutely.
They have to confront it.
No, they do. And I think many of those states, particularly in Western Europe, are just not politically at a point where they can confront it.
How
you
come?
know, well, I think, frankly, it's an immigration issue. Partially, there are large segments of these countries that are not willing to take stronger measures against immigration, acceptance of refugees, even things like surveillance. A big problem we have with the Europeans is they don't share privacy data on European citizens with us very well.
Still.
So, yeah, still, even, for example, with things like flight security, and that inhibits our ability to identify potential terrorists coming to the United States.
Now, how real is it now for them? In lieu of Manchester, which is still so ripe in the minds of everyone who gathers there today. And starting in Saudi Arabia, the president went there and said, you got to you got to pitch in too. We can't do everything.
Yeah.
And if you want to eradicate this, take a stand now. And that's the challenge he's laying before leaders in these Sunni nations and now in Western Europe.
Yeah, and in fact, I thought there was actually a missed opportunity in the trip to Saudi Arabia, because I felt that the Saudis really wanted something. They wanted help against Iran, which they felt had been lacking under the Obama administration. And I thought there was a real opportunity for the president to broker a deal with them, to say, hey, we will give you that help if you, no kidding, cut out the domestic incitement, the domestic intolerance, and the hatred towards Christians and Jews that not only goes on in the Persian Gulf, but that you fund in mosques and schools around the world. And I thought without that, it came off of as us doing something for them without getting to the core of this problem with terrorism.
Andrew Peak, stand by, okay? We're going to use you throughout the coming hour, all right?
Thanks.
They're live in Washington, and they're in NATO, at NATO headquarters in Brussels, is the Turkish president arriving for his meeting. 29 members early June when Montenegro becomes a member, and that is no small matter because of the deep water ports with access to the Adriatic. So all of this now is folding into the coverage right now at NATO. So stand by, President Trump, in a moment here, Shannon.
Along with that, new questions about border security. Officials say there is a surge in the amount of illegal drugs coming into the U.S. More on that in a live report. Illegal immigrants crossing the border has declined under the new administration, but the amount of illegal drugs coming into the country is on the rise. That is just one of the reasons President Trump says he wants more money to secure the border. National correspondent William Lajeunesse is live in L.A. with more. Good morning, William.
Well, Shannon, to the cartels, immigrants and drugs represent the same thing, revenue. And because of the decline in Central American smuggling dramatically, they have turned rather to hard drugs with high margins, especially meth and synthetic heroin.
On a typical day, a few months ago, you would see 3, 4, 5 rafts full of people coming across. Now, as you can see, there's not very much going on.
But a few miles away, smugglers are busy, not moving people, but drugs. In Texas, smugglers float fully loaded trucks filled with marijuana across the Rio Grande. This one got turned back by the Border Patrol, forcing the driver to ditch it in the river. Co-workers tried to swim the pot back to Mexico. And when we were there, it happened again. So moments ago, this pickup was on the U.S. side filled with marijuana. Border Patrol gave chase. They turned around, dumped it in the Rio Grande. We got about half the marijuana. The other half went back to Mexico on a raft. Most pot is backpacked over the border. By contrast, 81% of hard drugs cross at the ports of entry in cars.
We've seen narcotics come in shaped like carrots, mangoes, lime, watermelon, so they'll take advantage of whatever's there.
Agent's best defense, walks on 4 legs, not 2.
Really, it doesn't really matter. They train in all, in anything, marijuana, cocaine, heroin.
Americans get about 95% of their heroin, coke, and methamphetamine from Mexico, hidden in tires, bumpers, and buckets. Here in the Rio Grande Valley, seizures more than doubled from last year.
They need to make their profit somewhere, so now they're trying with narcotics.
So the Trump budget adds more manpower, roads, and fences, but stopping drugs is harder than people, Shannon. And experts say we probably catch maybe 20 to maybe 50% of all illegal narcotics. Back to you.
All right. William Lajeunesse, thank you very much.
So this is the story of the day. This is...
Just moments from now, President Trump will arrive at NATO's brand new headquarters, where he will officially take his seat beside our biggest allies across the globe. And his biggest message today, he's going to call on the alliance to join the battle against ISIS and to help foot the bill for doing that as well. Welcome to a brand new hour of America's Newsroom. I'm Shannon Breed.
Nice to see you, Shannon. I'm Bill Hemmer. Good morning, everybody. Morning at home. Fighting terror, defense spending tops the president's agenda. Meanwhile, NATO leaders want the president's commitment to mutual aid, a cornerstone of the NATO alliance.
Rich Edson's live at the State Department. All right, Rich, what are these NATO leaders looking for from our president?
Good morning, Shannon. They want an endorsement of Article 5. That's the part of the NATO treaty that says an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all NATO countries. And if you remember, then candidate Trump, during the campaign, called NATO obsolete. When he was elected president, some of the NATO countries were a little concerned about the United States' commitment to that article. Since then, the Secretary of State in March traveled to Brussels, met with NATO leaders, affirmed the U.S. commitment to that, though these leaders would really like to hear that commitment commitment from President Trump himself. He has the opportunity today. He's at NATO. He's about to participate in the Article 5 and Berlin Wall memorial unveiling, so it's a good venue to do so. As NATO confronts Russia, there have already been some disagreements in Brussels with the president. The president of the European Council said after his meeting with President Trump this morning that he's not 100% certain that they see eye to eye, that they have common positions and opinions about Russia, except on the issue of Ukraine, Shannon.
All right, so who exactly, Rich, do we know, is the president going to call out today?
Well, there are those nations that don't spend enough money, according to what the commitments of NATO are. First, though, there was a commitment made by NATO. NATO will join the anti-ISIS coalition. That's something the United States was looking for and received a commitment on. But then, of course, there is that 2% commitment. NATO wants these countries to spend 2% of the size of their economies on defense. Only 5 of the 28 countries do so. That's the United States, Greece, Britain, Estonia, Poland. At the bottom of that list, Canada spending less than 1%, Slovenia, Spain, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This is an issue that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has been pushing with these NATO countries, as the United States and the Trump administration has just unveiled its budget with the goal of spending less money internationally, at least on development and certain issues, while other countries spend more. Shannon?
All right, Rich Edson live for us at the State Department. Thank you, Rich.
Clearly, the backdrop for this meeting comes in light of this. Disturbing new details emerging about the man behind the deadly Manchester massacre. We are now learning the terrorist suspect traveled between Libya and Europe in the weeks and days leading up to that attack. All this as police conduct raids overnight across the city, arresting more in connection to that case.
I want to reassure people that the arrests that we have made are significant. And initial searches of premises have revealed items that we believe are very important to the investigation. It is vitally important that we continue those searches and do it very, very thoroughly.
Well, let's get back on the ground in Manchester. Greg Palcott reporting from there again today. And Greg, what is the latest as we look at, well, the number of arrests that occurred overnight?
Well, Bill, as the victims are remembered from Monday night's massacre by the mountains of flowers that continue to grow here in the center of Manchester, yes, that police investigation grows as well. There were arrests overnight. There were raids this morning. In custody right now, 8 different people, including one of the brothers of the attacker, Salam Abedi. Officials telling us that they are begin to come to grips with his terror network, which has been supporting him. Detained in Libya, his father and another brother. There are associations with those two, both with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but they are yet to be investigated. Abedi spent time in Libya. He also apparently has links and spent time in places like Germany, and also ties to terrorists, possible terrorists, in both Belgium and in France. And yes, the British people are furious. The officials here are furious with U.S. law enforcement leaks to the media. London says it is cutting off right now, anyway, its flow of information to the United States. Here is what a very angry mayor of Manchester told us.
This is wrong, morally. It's arrogant, but it's disrespectful to the people of Greater Manchester, but particularly to the families of those who lost loved ones and the injured. It must stop.
Meanwhile, we watched a very emotional minute of silence marked here, as it was across the United Kingdom. Remember, 22 people were killed today, more identified. There were more teenagers, and in the hospitals in this area, 75 remain, again, many of them young. Here's a bit of what the people here had to say to us today.
We can't be intimidated by these people. We've got to stand up and be strong, and Manchester is a strong city.
What did you feel when you first heard about the attack?
Felt sick. It was really shocked.
Felt sick?
Definitely, yeah. So it's nice to see everyone coming out and paying their respects, really.
I'm just worried for what's going to happen next, and all the children. It's just so sad.
You just come to show your respects.
Bill, the kids in the Children's Hospital here got another very special visitor today from the 91-year-old mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. She spent some time with the kids. Some strong emotions, some strong feelings here all over the city.
It goes a long way for the people of the UK, too. Thank you, Greg. Greg Palcott, good to have you back on the ground today there in Manchester.
Meanwhile, we watch and wait for President Trump's arrival at NATO headquarters. But here at home, another big story, the report from the Congressional Budget Office on the latest version of the Obamacare replacement bill out of the House. It estimates it's going to save money for the government and consumers, too. But it says millions more will lose their coverage. Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan's here to give us his reaction. He's part of the Critical Freedom Caucus. All right, Congressman, what do you make of these numbers? They paint a dire prediction, especially in states that may use the waivers to get out of some of the coverage requirements.
Well, actually, for states to use the waivers, they're going to see premiums come down. In many ways, the CBO report confirms what we in the Freedom Caucus were fighting for. We know we made this bill better by engaging in that intense and vigorous debate we had over the last several weeks. And CBO confirms that, as evidenced by the fact that if you're a state that gets a waiver, premiums come down significantly. If you get the full waiver, they come down even more. And frankly, even states who don't seek that waiver from some of those regulations, which we know are driving up costs, even states that don't get it, they're going to see some help as well. So we fought all along to say, look, we want premiums to come down for middle class and working class families in this country, and that happens under the bill that we work to make changes to.
Okay, so CBO says that's true of people who are generally healthy. They raise questions about whether those waivers will spike costs for older people, those with pre-existing conditions, or those who are less healthy.
We think it'll come down for everyone. I mean, we believe that CBO confirms that. And largely this number of those who lose coverage, that's driven a lot by young people who say, if you don't have to buy these expensive policies that Obamacare created, they're not going to buy it. So that drives a lot of that number. You see the 23 million number. But what we're focused on is we know this bill got better. The tax increases were gone because of the debate we engaged in that were in Obamacare. The mandates are gone. The safety net provision that is the high-risk pool is there that will help protect for those who may have pre-existing condition concerns. And then most importantly, premiums will come down because of this waiver that states can seek and the actions that we got in this legislation.
All right, I want to play a little bit of the reaction from Senate Minority Leader, Democrat Chuck Schumer.
The report makes clear Trump care would be a cancer on the American health care system, causing costs to skyrocket, making coverage unaffordable for those with pre-existing conditions and many seniors, and kicking millions off their health insurance. Unless you're a healthy millionaire, Trump care is a nightmare.
And in addition to that, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi calls it a devastating CBO score. You know that they are going to take PR points from this and run with them. They say it's going to be terrible for you in 2018.
And what they're describing is what we currently have. Right now, people who may have insurance can't really get coverage because if they can afford the premiums, they can't afford the deductibles. What Obamacare is creating the very things they just described. And never forget, I always come back to this. Never forget what we were told when this thing passed. When Obamacare passed several years ago, we were told if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. You like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Premiums will decline. Deductibles will go down. We were told premiums would come down $2,500. We were told the website would work. We were told the website's secure. All the lies we were told about this. So what Mr. Schumer is describing and Nancy Pelosi are describing is what we currently have. And we know it will get better, as evidenced by the fact CBO says premiums will, in fact, come down for families who've seen them skyrocket under Obamacare.
I want to ask you about the debt ceiling. I mean, it's something that's always looming. It is now coming. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said yesterday he'd like to see a clean vote on it before the August recess. You were part of the Freedom Caucus, one of the founders, and I saw your statement yesterday saying you don't think that we should be giving up clean increases. They should be paired with something else. You'd like to see it get done before August, but stop raising the limit, you say. So how does this work for the GOP?
No, going early is good, but let's do something that actually addresses the $20 trillion debt this country faces. So let's get some spending cuts now. Let's put in some structural changes that we think over the long term will keep government as a percentage of our overall economy, as an overall GDP at a smaller ratio. So let's do those things. That's how you begin to address the $20 trillion debt. So we're okay with raising the debt ceiling, but only if we actually begin to address the problem. We think that's the common sense thing to do. We think that's what American middle-class families have to do with their budget when they're faced with this kind of situation. So Congress should do the same thing. That's what we put out a statement yesterday. Yes, let's go early like the Treasury Secretary wants to, but let's begin to address the problem. Let's not just keep kicking the can down the road.
All right, Congressman Jim Jordan, always good to see you. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you, Shannon.
We are watching NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, and we believe any moment now President Donald Trump's going to wheel in with his motorcade of numerous vehicles, and when that happens, he will also be met with the German leader, Angela Merkel, and so many others, the NATO leader, Jens Stoltenberg, also. So as we await that, we reflect now for a moment with our colleague Brett Baer in Washington, D.C. And Brett, good morning to you. Welcome back from your trip overseas. And, you know, you think about the contrails of this trip already, Brett. This was a trip that was not a formality. This was a trip that was designed and established with deliberate intent and a message starting from the very first location, and that was Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So just reflect on that and what this administration and this president is trying to perhaps sell and lead to these leaders today.
Yeah, good morning, Bill. I think it is a big picture, 30,000-foot look at how this administration sees big things that could potentially happen. You know, peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Is it a long way off? Of course, but it is aspirational, and the images of the first three stops, the fact that the Saudis were the first stop, and then the image of the president on the Western Wall with his hand praying, and then meeting the Pope yesterday, the three major religions, and those three images starting off this trip in a significant way. So they think they've changed the dynamic a bit. Now they head to basically the wonky internal NATO and G7 negotiations that may not be as great visually, and there may be some pushback from some of those European leaders, but he's going to go in there in NATO with the message, pay your fair share.
Yeah, and the message, too, is deadly serious in light of events that we've been reporting on throughout this week. You can control your trip. You can set up your itinerary. You can say who you want to talk to and who you want to meet with, but events of the world can change at a moment's notice. And that's what we experienced on Monday night. This is the motorcade again arriving here at NATO headquarters in Brussels. In light of that, Brett, when you've got a president who's saying, look, we can't do all this for you, you have to step up and do your part as well, which is the same thing he said to Sunni leaders in Saudi Arabia. The message has been consistent. This is a call to arms to wipe out the threat of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all the branches that follow on.
Yeah, and it's powerful. I mean, if you think of more than 50 Muslim and Arab countries signing on to this fighting extremism and terrorism and fighting funding for that, and that, you know, one day later, this bombing happens in Manchester that is tied to a network, it looks like, that is expanding throughout England. A terrorist who went to Libya, which, by the way, NATO was involved in. It is all interconnected here. And so the message, I think, will not be one that is ignored. It's one that a lot of these leaders are anxious to make their case, because, believe it or not, naming and shaming is powerful. If President Trump gets into this table and says, okay, here's the deal, here are these countries, and here's what you've paid and not paid, that's embarrassing, frankly, for some of these countries who have been a part of NATO for so many years.
To our viewers, we're going to try and pick our spots as we go through this. So when there are comments, and we do expect President Trump to make about a 3-minute address here, Angela Merkel will make an address as well, Brett. And when that happens, we will certainly part ways with our microphones and bring that to our audience. Bear in mind the location, too, for NATO headquarters. Brussels, Belgium, you're coming off terror attacks that originated in that city, in the neighborhood of Malbeek on the western edge of Brussels, that were destined for Paris, France. And the airport that was hit in March of last year is just a few miles from NATO headquarters. They have felt this in a very real way. The question is, what do they do about it?
Yeah, as a brand new NATO headquarters, as you see the president walking in there with the NATO Secretary General, who also visited the White House earlier, just weeks ago, with the message that they will get all of these countries on board. I think they're a little bit apprehensive about what this new president will bring and what message he will bring. And in a sense, that is President Donald Trump, shaking things up a bit like the bull in the china shop. The hope is in the administration that they're just going to shake things up in a good way and make these countries, pull the line.
Shannon, we're just going to hang here for a moment and see if there's a live microphone in that hallway. It doesn't appear to be for now.
We don't ever want to miss anything, though. Bert, what do you make of the fact that former President Obama, though, just a short time ago was with German Chancellor Angela Merkel? A lot of people say, hey, he was in Italy, he's in Germany now. The White House is hoping this is a reset, that for President Trump, it introduces him to the world in a different way, and yet still that specter of the last president who was so popular in many of these places showing up in Europe as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of backslapping and laughing pictures, and he is the former leader that the Europeans liked. They liked being around him. They thought they were aligned with him more, perhaps, in a European sense. But President Trump is the one who obviously has the power, and obviously is the one who is going to be controlling this meeting, because the U.S. has the biggest say in NATO. I think it's going to be interesting, the interaction between all these leaders. I think you saw the handshake with the new French president, Macron, who was gripping very hard and holding on, kind of showing that he's an alpha leader too, I think. But President Trump is really the man of the moment here in this NATO meeting in Brussels.
We're told also Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, who was there also, will deliver a stern message to our president about intelligence leaks in light of Manchester. This president has seen in 4 months plenty of intelligence leaks back here at home, and how he receives that message will be interesting. You almost get a sense, welcome to my world. I'm dealing with this too.
Yeah, I think they'll be pointed towards the administration, at least what is being forecast by the Prime Minister, Theresa May, that she's concerned about the intelligence sharing. And you saw the Israelis, what they said publicly and then what they said privately about intelligence sharing. So I think that's going to be a big issue. The other issue here, Bill, is that this president has managed to move the ball in these countries more than any other president previously. This is not a new issue. This is not a new issue about having countries pay their fair share in NATO. The biggest proponent of that was Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who was Defense Secretary, obviously, for President Obama and President Bush. All of those administrations tried to do it, saying you can't have paper armies, saying you have to come to the table with the funding you promised. This is the only president in early days who's actually managed to move the needle, and these countries are changing their dynamic.
Well, I mean, they've got agreement to pay 2% of GDP toward the military defense. 5 of 28 members meet that. The United States, clearly. I think off the top of my head, it's Estonia, and it might be Poland, and it is the UK as well.
That's right. And obviously the U.S. is paying 4% and of GDP, and it's lopsided. This is a major, it's not obsolete. The president walked that phrase back, but he did say that each of these countries needs to do their fair share.
Brett, stand on by there, okay? We're waiting to address remarks from President Donald Trump, and we'll hear from Angela Merkel, too. She is there, and earlier today, coincidentally, she was with the former President Barack Obama at the Brandenburg Gate in central Berlin. So she moves from that location to this today, Shannon.
And we will listen in those remarks shortly. In the meantime, we're keeping on domestic issues as well, and we'll take you there live as soon as those 2 world leaders get to the mics. Stay with us. We're going to take you live to Brussels, to NATO headquarters, where we are awaiting remarks from President Donald Trump and also the leader of Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel. Both of them will be speaking just moments from now. We'll take you there live when that happens. In the meantime, let's bring in Steve Hayes of the Weekly Standard. Steve, good morning to you.
Morning, Jan.
I read an interesting article this week that was talking about that a lot of people think that Trump is out there to prove himself on this trip, but that there actually is this feeling within NATO that they want to win him over, given some of his tough comments. There's a special flyover. They're dedicating this big new building today. He's going to take part in this remembrance of Article 5, obviously invoked for the only time after 9/11, that they are wooing him a bit. What do you make of that?
Well, I think for the most part, that's sort of typical diplomatic courtesy that one extends to the leader of a country, particularly in this case, the leader of the United States, which is, as Bill was talking about with Chris Stirewalt, the de facto leader of NATO. And nothing, we must say, can outdo what the Saudis did for President Trump.
That was pretty spectacular.
It was. He said so himself.
Yeah, and now they're going to have this conversation here where we've talked a lot about how he said at one point NATO is obsolete. He had a lot of very negative things to say about it during the campaign. People often get into the White House, the Oval Office. They have different intel. They have a different way of looking at things when the realities of the world, square up with them. So, he is going to recognize, obviously, that this is a key military alliance, but at the same time really press for those nations who aren't coming anywhere near their obligations. How do you think those conversations will go?
Yeah, look, I think he can afford to be pretty tough here. I mean, as you said, he laid out his position on NATO during the campaign, overstated it a bit. There's no doubt that he has people around him like National Security Advisor McMaster, like General Mattis, and others who have stressed to him the importance of NATO as a strategic alliance and its role in keeping America safe. This is not a zero-sum game. This is an alliance where the United States gains quite a bit from being a part of it and helping to lead it. But I do think he has, he's got some capital here to push NATO member countries to make good on their commitments to spend what they've pledged to spend on defense. He can ask them to step up their involvement in the fight against ISIS and the fight against Al-Qaeda and the fight against jihadists across the world. And I think he will do that. I think the real question, particularly on that second part, is whether he will also show that the United States is willing to lead that fight, lead the fight against ISIS, take on Al-Qaeda, and have some skin in the game in a way that makes other countries want to participate along with us.
What about the issue of Russia?
Yeah, very interesting comments this morning from an EU leader who said, in effect, we don't see eye to eye on Russia. And the characterization that came out of that, at least according to Fox News reporting, was that Donald Trump was a little bit more optimistic about Vladimir Putin in the direction he was heading than the Europeans are. That will obviously have to be resolved. One would think that given the continuing provocations that we've seen from Russia and from Vladimir Putin, that the president might revise his views on Russia and Vladimir Putin in much the same way that he did on NATO, broadly speaking.
All right, stay with us, Steve, as we continue coverage this hour. We'll get back to you in just a minute as these things develop.
Just so our audience knows, this is what we're waiting on. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel will be there in a moment here. And along with President Donald Trump, they will unveil two memorials. One is a memorial to the Berlin Wall, and the other is a memorial to Article 5 of the NATO Constitution. And what that states, again, is that an attack on one is an attack on all. First invoked, by the way, after the attacks of September 11th here in New York City. So that's what we're waiting on. And we'll see a class photo, too, and when all the leaders get together. And, watch carefully, because sometimes it's rather interesting, the body language on behalf of world leaders when they stand together. So that's what we're all waiting on coming up this hour. I want to bring Brett back in here now. NATO ambassadors just yesterday, Brett, they approved the idea of joining all these other countries, I think 68 in the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, principally because we know with open borders in Europe, you can travel from Brussels and go to Syria and come back and then go to Paris and carry out a deadly attack. You can go from Brussels into Syria and come back and carry out a deadly attack at the airport in Brussels as well. And as we digest the information from this Manchester massacre, we know he was in Libya just a few days ago. Open borders are fine, but if you cannot control who's coming and who's going, and if your lack of surveillance leads to massacres like we saw Monday night, the leaders of these countries have a lot to answer for.
Yeah, if you think that we are concerned as a country, as a population, about terrorism, think about living in the heart of Europe, where the refugee and migrant population has increased exponentially after the Syria situation. And you've seen more of these radical Islamic events, terrorist attacks, and also cells that the intelligence community over there has been trying to break up. large cells throughout different parts of Europe. So as NATO gets involved in terrorism more and more, it is a direct link to all of these countries having to deal with this. And you make an important point, Bill. I mean, it gets to the protecting your borders, being careful who is coming in and who is coming out. If there's anybody who can speak to that, it is probably President Trump, who has mentioned his concern, obviously, for the U.S. border, and some of these European leaders know exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah, we talked about what NATO does in terms of changing, and the charge is there clearly. And if you read the Secretary General's report that he issued just this week, his opinion piece that you can read right now. That's Macron, the leader of France, there coming in as we watch these pictures above the blue carpet at the new headquarters there at NATO. What he talked about, and there's a long list of things that NATO's doing already, talking about helping to train troops in Afghanistan to stabilize that country. He talks about a coalition to defeat Islamic State by teaching soldiers counterterrorism, counterinsurgency tactics in places like Egypt and Jordan and Morocco, a regional center in Kuwait, operational hub in Naples, Italy, the headquarters in Brussels with new intel and a security division. While he says all that, he concludes by saying the following: while I'm very proud of what NATO's already doing in the fight against terrorism, I also believe NATO can do more. He continues, there are other possibilities. It would not mean NATO involvement in combat operations. And that last point, as the leaders gather here with Angela Merkel, I do believe, and the orange or red there in front, that last point, Brett, is something that European leaders have been debating for a long time now.
You just saw, I think, Bill, the new French president with an aggressive handshake, and I referenced the handshake they had in their one-on-one. I think perhaps President Trump was joking about that as they walk forward here on the blue carpet in NATO. It is an impressive building as you take a look at that new building where they'll be holding these meetings.
Yeah. When he talks about combat operations, that would take this whole operation to another level. I think in the near term, what these leaders are worried about is that how do they get the population that they now govern under control, and how they're able to step up surveillance within their own borders to make sure that their people have a sense of greater security, because now they are not living with it.
No, that's right, Bill. And I think to your point, there's also concern that the U.S. will always and eternally honor Article 5, and that is any country that is attacked, NATO members come to the support and aid of that country. With the actions of Russia, there is concern about the states like Estonia, Latvia, and others.
And Brett, you know, there's been some discussion about a conversation between Britain's Prime Minister and our president about potential leaks with regard to the Manchester investigation. And we're just now getting a statement. This comes to us from Serafin Gomez, our White House producer. He says this is from President Trump, issued by the White House. The alleged leaks coming out of government agencies are deeply troubling. These leaks have been going on for a long time, and my administration will get to the bottom of this. The leaks of sensitive information pose a grave threat to our national security. Adding this, I'm asking the Department of Justice and other relevant agencies to launch a complete review of this matter, and if appropriate, the culprits should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. There is no relationship we cherish more than the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom.
Yeah, it's a forceful statement, and one in which I think they're saying definitively they're concerned about her concerns. And, you know, the intelligence leaking is really a big issue. Here, abroad, it is the essence of how you keep things secret in order to help these different agencies do their jobs. And I think that statement is shows the importance of this moment.
This is the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg making an address, I believe, in German at the moment. Otherwise, we'd stop and listen. So, and I think Angela Merkel is second. So we will listen to her as well. What you're looking at now is the memorial that's being unveiled to mark the fall of the Berlin Wall going back to November of 1989. You know, Brett, a lot of this is framed today in a 2017 picture. But this has been an alliance for good for 50 years. And they kept the peace after what was considered, wars that involved millions of people that many thought would be never fought again. However, this alliance has kept the peace in this part of the world. Just want to drop in here real quick.
Is a reference to the future. However, if we are to find convincing answers for the future, it is good to remind ourselves of what we have achieved in the past and what we can build on. This fragment of the Berlin Wall embodies the history that during the Cold War has left its mark on NATO for many decades. However, this wall also symbolizes something that has been a determinant factor for my life for many years, because I lived on the eastern side of the wall. And that is the division of Berlin. It is an expression of the fact that if we stand firm, as did NATO, if we can rely on the courage of our friends from Central and Eastern Europe and the former DDR at the time, then we can bring down a wall and make it something to be remembered. Our alliance is united in the awareness of the importance to cooperate, to insist on freedom, and we also are united in the trust that it is not isolation and the building of walls that make us successful, but open societies that share the same values. Ladies and gentlemen, with the end of the East-West conflict, a new era began, a new era bringing new challenges and new dangers. But we continue to be an alliance built on shared values, showing solidarity towards its members. Germany will never forget the contribution NATO made towards making our country become reunited. And this is why we will continue to make our contribution towards security and solidarity as members of this alliance.
NATO's greatest strength is the enduring bond between North America and Europe. We saw the strength of that bond after the 9/11 attacks against the United States. And President Trump, those attacks struck at the heart of your own hometown in New York. And for the first time, NATO invoked our collective defense clause, Article 5. One for all and all for one. Hundreds of thousands of European and Canadian soldiers have served shoulder to shoulder with US troops in Afghanistan for over a decade, to help ensure it never again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists. It is our solidarity that keeps our nations safe. And when our open and free societies come under attack, we stand up for our values and our way of life. That is why a strong NATO is good for Europe and good for North America. The 9/11 and Article 5 memorial will be a daily reminder of our vital bond. And today we will commit to do more in our common struggle against terrorism. So, Mr. President, it is a great honor to have you here and a great honor to give you the floor. Please.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Stoltenberg, Chancellor Merkel. Thank you very much. Other heads of state and government, I'm honored to be here with members of an alliance that has promoted safety and peace across the world. Prime Minister May, all of the nations here today grieve with you and stand with you. I would like to ask that we now observe a moment of silence for the victims and families of the savage attack which took place in Manchester. Thank you. Terrible thing. This ceremony is a day for both remembrance and resolve. We remember and mourn those nearly 3,000 innocent people who were brutally murdered by terrorists on September 11th, 2001. Our NATO allies responded swiftly and decisively, invoking for the first time in its history the Article 5 collective defense commitments. The recent attack on Manchester in the United Kingdom demonstrates the depths of the evil we face with terrorism. Innocent little girls and so many others were horribly murdered and badly injured while attending a concert, beautiful lives with so much great potential, torn from their families forever and ever. It was a barbaric and vicious attack upon our civilization. All people who cherish life must unite in finding, exposing, and removing these killers and extremists. And yes, losers. They are losers. Wherever they exist in our societies, we must drive them out and never, ever let them back in. This call for driving out terrorism is a message I took to a historic gathering of Arab and Muslim leaders across the region, hosted by Saudi Arabia. There I spent much time with King Solomon, a wise man who wants to see things get much better rapidly. The leaders of the Middle East have agreed at this unprecedented meeting to stop funding the radical ideology that leads to this horrible terrorism all over the globe. My travels and meetings have given me renewed hope that nations of many faiths can unite to defeat terrorism, a common threat to all of humanity. Terrorism must be stopped in its tracks, or the horror you saw in Manchester and so many other places will continue forever. You have thousands and thousands of people pouring into our various countries and spreading throughout. And in many cases, we have no idea who they are. We must be tough, we must be strong, and we must be vigilant. The NATO of the future must include a great focus on terrorism and immigration, as well as threats from Russia and on NATO's eastern and southern borders. These grave security concerns are the same reason that I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years and not paying in those past years. Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined. If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves. We should recognize that with these chronic underpayments and growing threats, even 2% of GDP is insufficient to close the gaps in modernizing, readiness, and the size of forces. We have to make up for the many years lost. 2% is the bare minimum for confronting today's very real and very vicious threats. If NATO countries made their full and complete contributions, then NATO would be even stronger than it is today, especially from the threat of terrorism. I want to extend my appreciation to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York for contributing this remnant of the North Tower, as well as to Chancellor Merkel and the German people for donating this portion of the Berlin Wall. It is truly fitting that these two artifacts now reside here so close together at the new NATO headquarters. And I never asked once what the new NATO headquarters cost. I refuse to do that. But it is beautiful. Each one marks a pivotal event in the history of this alliance and in the eternal battle between good and evil. On one side, a testament to the triumph of our ideals over a totalitarian communist ideology bent on the oppression of millions and millions of people. On the other, a painful reminder of the barbaric evil that still exists in the world and that we must confront and defeat together as a group, as a world. This twisted mass of metal reminds us not only of what we have lost, but also what forever endures, the courage of our people, the strength of our resolve, and the commitments that bind us together as one. We will never forget the lives that were lost. We will never forsake the friends who stood by our side. And we will never waver in our determination to defeat terrorism and to achieve lasting security, prosperity, and peace. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
He is direct, he is a disruptor, and that is part of the main reason he was elected last November. This was a striking comment by President Donald Trump standing in front of all NATO leaders there at their brand new shiny headquarters there in Brussels, Belgium, talking about this is not fair based on the contribution, the financial commitments on behalf of NATO countries, all 28, said to be 29 in early June when Montenegro joins. This is not fair to taxpayers of the United States. He called out the massacre in Manchester again, repeating his line from the other day, they are losers, talking about the depths of evil, beautiful lives torn forever from their families, encouraging all leaders here to be tough and to be strong. And you contrast that with the message from Angela Merkel before him. It is not isolation and building of walls that make us successful, but open societies that share the same values. And therein lies the debate. How do you have an open society while at the same time keeping your people safe in the current war against this Islamic threat? With that as a backdrop, Shannon has more now.
Yeah, we want to bring in Ambassador Nick Burns, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO and former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Ambassador, you are keenly familiar with this conversation about calling on these other nations to pay up and be a part of this. The president, we knew he'd bring it up. Wasn't sure he was going to do it during this very solemn occasion and dedication, but he also made sort of a remark there about how beautiful the headquarters were. And essentially, I'm not going to ask how much it cost, suggesting that the U.S. basically footed the bill for it. Did you expect him to bring that up so publicly here?
Well, I think President Trump was right to bring up the fact that many of our European allies, the majority, aren't paying enough, aren't covering enough in their defense spending to cover their obligations. Every American president for decades has raised it. He's right to raise that. I thought his remarks identifying with the British people over this terrible terrorist attack in Manchester were appropriate. But frankly, I thought there was a missed opportunity here by President Trump. He needs to be the leader of NATO and the leader of the West. This was a solemn ceremony to commemorate 9/11, as well as the Manchester attacks, and to dedicate this new headquarters. He only fleetingly, in 2 or 3 words, condemned the threat from Russia. What's on the minds of those European leaders behind them? Vladimir Putin invading countries in Eastern Europe. They need American leadership to contain the Russians, and the president barely mentioned that. And I was American ambassador on 9/11 to NATO. I remember when all the Europeans came to our defense, they all went into Afghanistan. They've been fighting terrorism with us in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and no mention of that by President Trump. No kind of big-hearted thanks to the Europeans. He's not succeeding at becoming the leader that Ronald Reagan was, or that Bill Clinton was, or John F. Kennedy, or Dwight D. Eisenhower. He needs to speak with more sophistication to an audience like those European leaders behind him.
Yeah, and this big meeting comes just 4 months into the start of his presidency. We know for President Reagan, his first big international trip was, I think, well into 2 years into his first term. Do you think this president will grow into that role that you're talking about being the leader here? There could be some tense conversations with some of these leaders once they leave this public ceremony today.
Well, I hope he will, because we all want President Trump to succeed. I think with the Europeans, I've just come from Europe, I think they're a little bit puzzled because when they hear Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis in Europe, they respond to them because there's clarity and there's forcefulness in the United States opposing Russia and acknowledging that the Europeans are in the fight against terrorism. They're not hearing that from President Trump, so there's a gap between the president and his cabinet officers in what the Europeans are hearing, and I think President Trump needs to speak more like his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense.
Well, you know he's been so critical on many occasions publicly because of the way he thinks they've handled their migrant crisis and the way he thinks that they've opened themselves up to a lot of these threats by having the free flow of borders and those kinds of things. So it does seem as if his cabinet members have had part of the conversation. He's had the other part of the conversation that's been very critical.
And that's, I think, unfortunate because every past Republican president has believed that the United States has an obligation to take in immigrants and refugees. Every Republican president in the last 70 years has done that. And we have the world's greatest humanitarian crisis right now since 1945, the crisis in Syria, 12 million homeless. And President Trump's position is that he will take in no Syrian refugees. That, I think, is contrary to the interests of our country. It's contrary to the values of both of our political parties. It's another reason why the Europeans, who've borne the brunt of this, want more help from the United States.
Yeah, and that travel ban 2.0 that is now caught up in the courts was a pause on those refugees. We will watch and see. Ambassador Burns, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
He said he was direct with the Secretary General of NATO, and he was direct in his address there. More analysis with Brett Baer and Stephen Hayes standing by and listening along the way. Brett, your reaction on an address that reminded me a little bit of the inauguration speech in Washington. He did not hold back.
No, he did not hold back, and I appreciate Ambassador Burns' comments, but this is President Trump. He is unique. He is different. He was elected because he is different, and the people who elected him say they expect him to shake things up. And when these countries have not been paying their 2%, not only for this year, but for all these previous years, could he say that in private? Yes. Does he say it in public and makes a big splash? Yes. And does he do it in a very... In there was a remembrance of and moment of silence for Manchester and those killed, standing by Prime Minister Theresa May in every way possible, acknowledging Chancellor Merkel, and but with some harsh words in there. This is President Trump, and that is his delivery and him shaking things up.
Yeah. I'm reminded that so often we in the media live in our own echo chamber, and I was in Ohio for a few days over the weekend, and I asked a lot of people, how's Trump doing? And so many said he's our best chance, Steve. And others who voted for him and supported him questioned some of the decisions he makes and how he does it. But nonetheless, the theme that seemed to come back repeatedly is that he's not a politician and he's not going to do it the same way everybody else has. And I think this was a perfect example of that we just watched in Brussels, Steve.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we've seen some polling that suggests some erosion in Trump's base here at home, but if you look at what he's asking NATO members to do, he's asking them simply to make good on commitments that they've already made and that they made voluntarily. I don't understand how that's controversial in the least. Yeah. And you're seeing, I go on Twitter and I'm seeing the snark from reporters covering him and those back here in the United States. This is not a controversial thing to ask people to actually pay what they've committed to pay. I'm sort of baffled by it, but this might be another example of the phenomenon that this University of Virginia professor describes as Trump exceptionalism, where reporters sort of leap to conclusions that because Donald Trump is doing it must be new and different. In this case, I think Trump is absolutely within his rights to be making these requests, and it would have been odd, frankly, if he gave the speech and didn't do that.
Yeah, I was just looking,
one point,
yeah, sure. I was just looking for the information here. Just so you know, of the 28 countries, 5 countries in NATO met the 2% GDP goal. They were the United States, the United Kingdom, Greece, Poland, and Estonia. Go ahead, Brent.
President Obama, in an interview with The Atlantic, said he hates free riders, talking about, people who are just free riding. This was an issue back in the Obama administration. As I mentioned before, Defense Secretary Robert Gates had a real problem with these countries not paying the 2% they promised. Before that, when I covered the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld had a real problem and confronted them directly in these NATO meetings and different meetings around the world. It has happened time and time again, but the countries still have never paid. Guess what? Some of these countries are now paying, in part because President Trump is mentioning it in public. It may feel bad, it may be awkward, but there's something happening.
Yeah, a means to an end, I think, is how he would argue that. And you're very right, Brett. This speech was prepared. He knew exactly what he was saying and did not hold back. Steve, how do you think, if we can, reverse our discussion here and put yourself in the seat of these European leaders? Do they like this blunt talk? How do they react to it? Do they react to it?
Well, I'm sure they don't like the blunt talk. Nobody likes to be scolded in public as you're standing there unable to respond. But it's a necessary message. I think he's totally within his rights to make the argument that he did. I would expect that they wouldn't like the public scolding, but they might respond well to it. I mean, sometimes you have to be tough. You have to be harsh. You have to be undiplomatic to change the way things are done. And if that's the result here, I think it's a good one. I will say, I think Donald Trump should pick up on the argument he made here and talk more about what the Europeans are getting in this alliance. I mean, why it's so important that they contribute their fair share, that they embrace the cause of the alliance, that they step up their participation in anti-jihadist combat around the world. He can do a better job of laying those things out and making it clear what they're getting and why, reminding them why they're in the alliance.
This is a photo op, we believe, right? That's what's happening right now at headquarters here in Shannon. We know yesterday the NATO ambassadors did agree for the Western Military Alliance to go ahead and join the U.S.-led coalition, of which there are 68 countries in a battle against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. That would pave the way for a formal endorsement by the leaders you see gathered there on the blue carpet.
Yeah, I mean, that's significant as they disperse now. Listen, that's the way to get a photo done, organized and done. In the meantime, Brett, I want to ask you about the fact that the president did mention Russia, but as Ambassador Burns noted, it was a brief mention. He said that these countries want to hear more about that and what the U.S. is going to do. What do you make of, there was a mention, but was it enough?
Yeah, I think there'll be analysis of that, of how much needed to be said. Clearly, the statement was made that Russia needs to be pushed back, if you will. I forget the exact line that he uses there. But that is a concern, to the ambassador's point, for these nations who are most concerned about Russia's aggression and the possibility that, like he did in Georgia, Vladimir Putin could cross the line again in another country. And that's what that Article 5 is all about.
Newt Gingrich writes today in the Washington Post, and to our viewers, I encourage you to read it. He's trying to put a summation on this trip overseas, and he basically frames it as a call to arms. But one line in there really sticks out, and that is the principled realism was the way that President Trump phrased it earlier on this trip. That's based, Gingrich writes, on a clear-eyed view of America's interests, security, and limits. And Steve, I think that last word is very important. The limits of American reach, influence, power, logistics, be it financial or otherwise. President Trump is there to make the point that we've done a lot of heavy lifting, and now it's time to get something else in return. Steve, final word.
Well, I think if you look back on this trip, what President Trump has provided is the moral clarity, particularly in the 9/11 wars, that was missing, frankly, during the Obama administration.
Steve, thank you. Stephen Hayes, Brett Baer with us as we watch the NATO leaders there file out of the outdoor area and into a meeting there at NATO headquarters. We're going to follow this trip here, Shannon, as we go more forward throughout the day. Tomorrow it's the G7 in Italy. So this tour rolls on with deliberate intent at every stop.
It does, and as the president continues and wraps up, we will follow every step of it, all of it live again tomorrow. It's not letting up.
That's right.
It's changing the conversation.
You got to have a good Thursday, everybody. Happening Now starts right on. Our coverage continues also here on the Fox News Channel.
Fox News alert President Trump with a stern message for NATO, speaking at its headquarters, as you just saw moments ago. Hello and welcome to Happening Now, everybody. I'm Jenna Lee.
Nice to be with you. Nice to be with you at home on this busy Thursday. I'm Leland Vittert in for John Scott. This is the climate.